Saudi Arabia has been trying to diversify according to the view for 2030. And of course, it is for them, diversification is not a luxury but a necessity. For instance, they are consuming 3.9 million barrels a day out of a production just over 10 million. And the division is 1.6 million barrels a day go towards desalination plants. They have 27 desalination plants from which 70% of drinking water is produced. They use 1.2 million barrels a day for electricity generation and 1.1 million barrels a day for transportation, a total of 3.9. So they have if they continue consuming energy and or oil at the rate they are using, which is around 7% according to estimates from Saudi Aramco, it means that by 2025, Saudi Arabia will hardly have any major oil to export. So that's why Vision 2030 has come onto the scene. Now, whether it will be, they will manage to execute it or not depends to be, we will wait and see. However, the objective now by Saudi Arabia is to replace the oil used for electricity generation and desalination by solar and nuclear power. That's why they have been contracting for 24 nuclear reactors, and they are investing heavily in renewable energy, solar power. We will see whether that will succeed. There was a point, well, what would that be, what would impact will that be on the petrodollar, I think, part of the session? It will have no impact whatsoever, because what it will do, it will add to the longevity of Saudi Arabia oil reserves. It will enable them to export more and earn more, and of course, invest more in renewable energy. But in the immediate future, it will have no impact whatsoever on the petrodollar, because they will still be using it and eventually using the petro yuan.
No risk for a military adventure. I don't think so. It's, I mean, whatever military is coming up between, and let's name the countries, the US and China, is probably going to play out in the South China Sea and going to remain limited to that. I would be personally extremely surprised if there is real hard, let's say, confrontation over there. There might be an accident. Those situations are always very, very tense, so you never know what happens. Somebody might be super nervous. But on the other side, on both sides, you have a lot of attention on that, a lot of control on that. And I do expect that even accidents will remain extremely limited in scope. Nobody wants to go for a military adventure right now.
The US will not be able to, like European Union will not be able to buy cheap products and raw materials as they have done 20 years ago. So prices will become a bit more expensive in Europe. Our overall wealth will most likely also decline, and we will see most of that wealth shift to the Far Eastern sphere in a way.
The petrodollar itself, as a system, or the dollar as a lead currency of the world, is more the result of the trust in the American economy that the world has put than anything else, because you can think whatever you want about America, but people do trust America way more than most of those other countries, including China and Russia. Proof, look at the investment figures of Chinese millionaires and billionaires on the west coast of the United States over the last 18 months. Pretty much any property that has been up for sale from Portland down to San Diego has been bought by Chinese investors, very simply because they are bringing their money out of the country. That's a very, very potent sign of what the situation in China right now is. It's not as strong as people would like to believe. Now let me come to the OBOR initiative, the Belt and Road. It's a let's say, a work scheme for the Chinese industries. And if you just look what's happening over the last 3 to 4 months, look at the old Bloomberg and Reuters articles, even countries that are firmly on the Chinese side, like Pakistan, they start to question the terms of those rules. It's not a Marshall Plan. It's not like China comes and drops boatloads of money on you in order to allow you to develop peacefully. No, those are more or less slave contracts, and people start to find out about that. When there's a new administration coming in, like it's in Pakistan today, people start to challenge that because they say we'll never be able to pay that back. Look at Malaysia, look at small countries like Nauru, for example. There's lots of countries that try to pull out of those agreements right now. So it is slowly falling apart because this is not a Marshall Plan to help somebody else to develop. This is a working scheme to help Chinese industries that have overbuilt massively over the last 15 years to get new work in order to prevent them from bankruptcy, which actually is more or less the foundation of the Chinese system. If this whole thing fails, we might see China not growing, but shrinking.
The other thing is that the partnership between Russia and China has helped Russia a lot, particularly after the imposition of sanctions in 2014 by the United States. China provided a lot of financial support to stabilize the ruble. The ruble now is used in parts of China as if it is a Chinese currency. And of course, many of the projects in China involved in gas and oil are being financed with a lot of money from China. So from these cases, I think the Silk and Belt Initiative is very important for the global market, and the partnership between China and Russia is a stabilizing factor, and it will be the force which will shape the world in coming years and transform the world from a unipolar world into a multipolar world. So it all benefits the global economy in geopolitics and economy. Or the European Union has no alternative but to accept Chinese investments, because China is the biggest market for European exports. So they have no alternative. You cannot want to export to the biggest market and at the same time refuse investment in Europe. The other thing is that if they do refuse at the expense of losing their exports to China, the Chinese can easily invest a lot in Russia. They have been doing exactly that. Most of the recent gas production from the Arctic was financed by Chinese money. And with that in mind, China is happy to oblige. They have the resources and they now get the money. So the benefit is mutual to both of them. Who will be the loser? Europe in that case. The United States is a different kettle of fish because they can excuse their rejection of investment by China on security matters. But sooner or later, like Europe, they will still have to accept investment from China.
And that is how I see that this is going to go on. That said, a signature breakaway between the US and the EU is probably not coming. I think what you will see is a lot of northern and southern European dissection, i.e. the northern Europeans would probably look more towards Washington, and the southern Europeans, frustrated by the macroeconomic dynamic, might think maybe we're better off being friends with Russia and China. So that's my thinking.
The Chinese Russian partnership is the biggest bloc in the world now, commercially, militarily, politically. And the Europeans, although they are currently the biggest bloc ahead of China and ahead of the United States at, I think, 22% of the global economy, sooner or later, they will have to look at their interests. Because the United States, which says they are my friends, looks after its own interests. So they will have to shift. Where would you shift in terms of global trade? Towards the biggest bloc. That's why it is logical and inevitable that they will have to move that way. Even the United States will find itself moving even that way by continuing trade with them. But the European Union in particular, although they have the economic muscle, they haven't yet showed any political muscle. That's why they feel all the time bossed by the United States. But sooner or later they will have to find their feet and they will shift towards the biggest bloc, which is Russia and China.
I think there are a couple of things, first of all, before we, that I would like to put forward. First of all is, whether we are talking about the short run, medium, or the long run. And why I'm saying that is definitely in the short and medium run, I don't see how the world is going to shift to the petrol one. You mentioned the 10-year period that you see that the one become a dominant currency. I think that's pretty much soon. I don't see that. And there are a lot of reasons why is that. I will explain a bit. The other issue is we talk a lot about size, that China is the largest economy and it has overtaken the US. Let's recall that even when the US overtook the British Empire, that was in the 1880. It took 40 more years to become the dominant economy. So it's not that size matters. What it matters, first of all, I think, and this is why I cannot see any shift at the moment, any true threat to the dollar at the moment, is first of all, the one doesn't have the recycling capacity. People don't trust the markets in China. Still, investors, what they're interested at is a safe haven. We saw that there was a global crisis 10 years ago, and still, where the money was going, it was to the US Treasury bills to save them. But that was the country that originated the crisis. So you can see it's an important factor to understand that still the one doesn't have that capacity. The other aspect is, again, China is lagging in terms of governance, rule of law, things that actually are heavily appreciated when it comes to become a huge reserve currency. On top of that, we see that despite the fact that they introduced the one-denominated oil contract, futures contracts, we still see that the main speculation is still on the WTI. We still see that the bulk amount of financial transactions is in dollars, and still, even though, for example, the IMF has increased the margin on the importance of the yuan to their special drawing rights, it's still, central banks don't really use yuan for their reserves. So it's still, I think it's pretty much early to say, that's why I'm saying that whether you talk about the short, medium, or long run, to say that the yuan is actually going to take over. Possibly in not 10 years' time, maybe more than that, we will see a dual system, possibly 3 currencies dominating the world. But at the moment, I don't see how dollar can lose its dominance. At least I don't see the steam there.
What I'll do is, based on what the other panelists, my colleagues have said, I'll just compartmentalize it straight down to the hypothesis of petro-yuan. And of course, it's no longer a hypothesis since 26th of March, when the first contract made its debut in Shanghai. And who were the initial takers? The initial takers we found were Russia, Iraq partially. They never said they'll give up on the dollar, but they're very happy to trade in yuan. Iran called the US dollar a useless piece of paper, as they have been for a number of years, but they still need it. And there's Indonesia, Angola, and Nigeria. So that was the club. And of course, Glencore took part in the exercise partially, and so the Trafigura and a few other commodities. Now, this is a very predictable bunch to me. 2 leading traders who deal with the Chinese all the time thought they should turn up. The Angolans and the Nigerians need an alternative market, especially because American exports have literally, after shale, of their light crude, gone down to 0. So I would say the usual suspects turned up. Iraq was a bit of a surprise, but they made very clear that they're happy to partake in the exercise, but that no indication should be taken about their preference or otherwise. Now, the concept of petro-yuan. Now, how does a contract work when the currency itself that is underpinning, and they also give it a gold underpinning, that's how it debuted in March. But when the currency itself is so illiquid that it has to be set every day, that there is government interference, who would want to enter into a contract based on such a currency? So that is the first critical point here, that the liquidity is the real killer here for a petro-yuan premised contract to really take off. Secondly, some of the opportunities that a lot of people use between the physical and the paper market are opportunities for hedging, for arbitrage. If the currency underpinning a contract is so illiquid, how can those things come into play? And finally, we had last year, maybe give it a margin of error of maybe 5% plus or minus, but last year we had about $14 trillion worth of oil contracts changing hands. It's the world's largest traded commodity. And there you have it. It was $14 trillion. So it is a position of preeminence that has been established over 4 decades. I'm not saying that it cannot be dethroned, but right now when the Shanghai Stock Exchange feels like a bit of a casino, that you'll find a number of Chinese companies who are listed there. They'll have their A listing in Shanghai, but they'll always have a B listing in Hong Kong. So that in itself gives you an indication of what the market is like. So if the exchange and the dynamic, the regulatory dynamic and the currency itself is not mature enough, then a futures contract premise on that cannot take off. And I think what the volume that they had in March was about 15.4 million barrels of contracts that change hands, and that's what China imports in 2 days. So it gives you a little bit of a, but what I don't want to do is to draw a direct connection between the petro-yuan hypothesis and the Silk Road. They're two very different things. The Silk Road initiative is more about the Chinese spreading their wings. Whatever politics underpins it, whether it means building roads only to their refineries or plants or mines in West Africa or in the emerging markets, that's a different story. So, but the Silk Road and petro-yuan not sort of joined at the hip, in my opinion. If Trump's objective is to play the game wherever he can with various European capitals, he will. The Baltics were promised US gas to a lot of fanfare in Lithuania and in Poland, even though it's logistically not possible for the Americans to supplant Russian natural gas imports to the Baltics, and even though it's not even a big market. So that was one indication. He's also challenged the Germans on NATO, on their spending on NATO. He's had various pops more at his friends than against his allies, than against his enemies. So that kind of attitude tells me is that Trump plays the moment. And that is how I see that this is going to go on. That said, a signature breakaway between the US and the EU is probably not coming. I think what you will see is a lot of northern and southern European dissection, i.e. the northern Europeans would probably look more towards Washington, and the southern Europeans, frustrated by the macroeconomic dynamic, might think maybe we're better off being friends with Russia and China. So that's my thinking.
When we talk to government officials and to corporates about the potential of LNG supply to Europe, for example, one of the biggest issues was, dear Europeans, be aware you might be dependent on Russia. You might need to implement reverse flow in your pipeline systems. You must increase pipelines. You must increase storage. You must diversify supply sources. And that struck me very strange, because if you look at the third energy package and even before that, diversity in supply sources, increasing market integration, I mean, those are key pillars of our energy markets. And somehow I got the impression that, at least on a government, sometimes think tank level, they are a few years behind. If you talk to the corporates, those exporting to Europe, Cheniere, Cameron LNG, whatsoever, they're absolutely best informed you can be on European markets. And that is kind of gap between the corporate world and the government world in the US.
Definitely Europeans do not seem happy with the US. We saw that also with the Iran sanctions. They didn't back them up. Overall, it seems that Europe moves closer to Russia, especially when it comes to the other aspect that could be important, of course, and I don't have a real opinion how it could play out, is the fact that obviously being dependent on the Russian energy, having the majority of the European members to be member of the NATO creates a lot of problems inside NATO, right? A lot of disagreement if you have then Russia, which is not a NATO member, like, you know, like if they don't like what you're actually voting, cut the supply. They've done that to Ukraine before. Why they don't do that like into Europe? I'm not saying it's that easy, but it's something important to actually think about.
One fact confronting us is that Russian dominance on the European gas market is assured for the future. Why? Because they have integrated industry, they have well-established pipelines, they have the reserves, and they have proven that they are a reliable supplier. And they provide cheap piped gas. So that's established. Now the Americans want to sell their LNG. Of course, the bashing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the dominance of the Russians, of course, it's self-motivated as well as geopolitical. They are right to think that the Europeans should diversify rather than being dependent on Russian gas supplies for now it has reached almost 40%. However, the Europeans are saying we are not against buying American LNG, but we will buy it as part of the diversification, but not at any price. Until US LNG matches the European or the Russian piped gas, the Americans have very limited window of opportunity there. Now, for instance, in the Nord Stream, I know the Russians want to avoid the Ukraine, but Putin has said he will continue to send some gas supplies through the Ukraine. Trump, for instance, threatened Angela Merkel with sanctions if she doesn't abandon the Nord Stream. Credit to her, the following day she authorized the construction of Nord Stream in the Russian, in the German waters and land. So that is the situation now between America. The Nord Stream is unstoppable, and Russia's dominance is being also enhanced by the finishing on the 19th of this month of the first pipeline, the Turkish Stream, to supply Turkey and then the European Union. So from that angle, there is some future in the long term for American LNG, but they have to realize that they have to match the Russian prices, otherwise you can forget about it. Poland accepted LNG even though it is far higher than Russian supplies, but then Poland and the Baltic states are in the pocket of the United States.
What the Americans care about is having a safety valve. What they want to continue doing over the next 20 years is going to Asia and send all the cargoes over there. Don't believe me? Go to the projects. Go to the single companies. Tellurian, Cheniere. Go to, for example, just about 2 weeks ago, I met Vivek Chandra, the CEO of Texas LNG in London. And that's exactly what he told me. He told me, Europe, who is Europe? What is Europe? Nothing to me, because they don't pay the prices I want. So they care about Asia. But what they know is Asia won't be able to take every single cargo that America produces. So what they need is a market that they can dump their excess LNG on. And that's what they're looking in Europe for. They want to have a safety valve because Asia is not able just to take LNG and store it. They don't have underground storage the way we have it over here. What they have is very, very immediate supply and very, very immediate demand. And their seasonal fluctuations cannot be equalized with underground storage as we do that. So they have to do that through the external markets. And that's what Europe actually is here for. That actually is a huge chance for Europe, because Europe might, if it positions itself intelligently, which I personally like to question from time to time, it might be some sort of a quasi market maker for LNG in the future. if it can do so. But the problem is, for the moment, we are not talking with that language. For the moment, we are still believing that we are the place that the Americans and the Russians are fighting about, but they are fighting on a very, very different level. The Russians have no option. They have only Europe for their gas, with a little bit of a gas pipeline to Asia, but that's still very insignificant. What they have is Europe. If Europe doesn't buy their gas anymore, it's goodbye Russia. Whereas the Americans, they are fighting for a dumping ground, a security valve. It's much less important for the Americans than it is for the Russians. That's why it's such an unequal fight. And that's why the battlefield is going to be extremely lopsided. Last remark is Russian gas. We seem to believe that Russian gas is always going to be the cheapest gas on the planet. It's just the same fallacy as Saudi Arabian oil is always going to be the cheapest oil on the planet. No, it's not. There is old fields in Russia that have been developed when Stalin was still alive. And those fields are still producing, but they are near their end of life. They are cheap. Why? Because the investment has been written off a long time ago. There are new fields in the Yamal Peninsula that will be a new backbone of the Russian production, plus in the deep Arctic. This is not the same as the old fields. Those are very, very expensive fields to develop. And I had a couple of people already knowing about Russian upstream saying that current European gas prices cannot pay for those fields. So it will be very, very funny to see when the old fields actually stop producing and the new fields have to take up the slack, what's going to happen to the Russian position. But that's a debate that we're going to lead in the next decade.
I think that that's true. A lot of Chinese are not only investing at the Western Pacific region in California, they invest in the whole Pacific region. They invest in Hong Kong, they invest in Philippines, and they have a lot of money. They sit on a lot of liquidity because China has been running a huge trade surplus for 20 years or more. So they need to invest that. That's not necessarily a sign of, capital flight. So remember, there's a huge upper middle class in China that needs to invest that money, and there are just not that many resources to invest to in China. There was infrastructure projects going on. They were building ghost cities effectively. They need to. One of the reasons why China is investing in the Silicon Belt Road is to utilize the resources they have to invest, to have a stake in a wider area, in a wider periphery of their economic activity and their political interest. It's not necessarily driven because people are trying to run out. There's certainly people who want to be invested in the West as well. That's true. But I think it just speaks to the power to the economic power of China, that they're just spilling over of capital and liquidity for now. So that could be also a reality. I'm not saying that's the truth. That's one hypothesis. There are multiple hypotheses. We have to validate them. And coming back to the question, I live in the West. I've been born and raised here. So one of the question is, and that's going to affect the discussion, what will happen with the dollar? What will happen with economy, with wealth? Is what kind of strategy can the West, as an economical, political, and cultural entity, craft to counter the growing influence or power of alternative political blocs? First of all, we need to agree whether or not these alternative blocs do genuinely pose a threat to the US or to Europe. There's no question that it's going to pose a threat to the hegemony, right? We have to address that if we want to have hegemony. But does it pose materialistic, like a material threat to the way we live, to our standards of living, and to maintaining our social equilibrium? That's what we need to answer strategically, and then society and the political echelon has to come up with a counter strategy. We cannot lament the whole time China is going better. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that they have momentum. We have been lacking, like for years and years, of a sensible and tangible strategy to counter that, and that has harmed the reputation of the West. We have not been able. We have been going to the tables, bargaining with them. We went away.
The problem is that there is, and the global crisis picture that, there is a huge accumulation of capital in such small number of people that doesn't leave room actually for real growth. We don't talk about finance growth, yes? At the moment, the majority of the growth number that we see, it's purely driven by the finance capital. There is nothing related to production, manufacturing. Everything goes through money-making business. That's definitely not sustainable. China, Russia, India, they do have production capabilities. The West, it seems that they have, not they don't have it, they ignored it. Everybody, like I'm in the university and every single student, they says, I want to become a financier. I said, well done. And who's going to build the buildings to do your finance business? You know, it's a very simple thing, right? So that's why I was mainly nodding. Yeah.
That's the big problem that we're having. The problem is us. The problem is not anybody else. It's not even China. It's not even Russia. China and Russia and all the other countries, including Iran, they do what they have to do. They do what's in their own self-interest. If it's sustainable or not, it's not the question. For us, it shouldn't matter. It does matter. Why? Because we have pinned our hopes on them. Just remember back a couple of years ago, everybody talked about the BRICS. The BRICS countries were the hope of the world. They will save the world economy because everything else is in doldrums. Now look at the BRICS where they are today. China is at the breaking point. India is at the breaking point. It cannot reform itself. Brazil is in complete free fall. Russia is in an economic quagmire today. They cannot even seem to pull themselves out of this whole thing. All those countries have enormous problems, and we pin our hopes on them. Why do we do that? Why don't we look at ourselves? If we get our house in order, those problems on the periphery should matter to us just peripherically. That means they should be problems. We should look at them, but if our house is in order, it should affect us mortally. Our problem is that we need to reform our systems, our Western economical and political systems. We need to take the responsibility for our own systems, our own companies, our own lives into our own hands anymore, and of course take the responsibility for all the failures that we have without any excuses. As I said before, the end of the Cold War was probably the worst catastrophe that has happened to us because it has robbed us of a feared enemy. We thought that just anything goes. Now, we're sitting over here in Europe and we look at that as singular situation, as, oh my God, we have a problem now. One of our core industries is dying. Instead of looking at that as a source of an opportunity, what could the opportunity be? Europe is a continent where the internal combustion engine has been actually pushed to its limits. Now, what combusts like diesel as well is natural gas, or biogas for that matter. That would be a solution that we could use in order to clean up our transport, and at the same time actually get some climate credits, and at the same time build up the competence that is needed to do such a thing. Europe is one of the very few places on earth where there is such a huge market that could be transformed so quickly. We have all the know-how here. It needs to be put together. When we created LNG Austria last year out of an initiative, we did so because we were so desperate that no company or no actor over here was taking the bait and saying that that's a problem, but the problem is an opportunity for me to grab a bigger market. There's a couple of companies in Europe. Iveco, for example, does that. They are capitalizing on that. They say that we can grab new market share from the other players, but that's tiny. It's absolutely nothing yet. What we could do is actually grab that whole problem, transform it, build something better out of it, develop competences that nobody has on earth, and then once we got it running over here, besides having cleaned up the whole transportation system, there would be other regions on earth come and look how we did it, and that has always been a source of money. So how could we profit from that whole thing? Yeah, we could put ourselves in between, allow the Americans to dump more LNG onto Europe and use that LNG to clean up our transportation system instead of using the battle between Russia and the Americans in order to determine, do we need another LNG terminal on the north coast? Do we need a pipeline on the north coast? Let's build all the infrastructure that we can get into Europe and use it to our best advantage instead of this political bickering.
Still, with my parting shot, there will never be a post-oil era, no matter what the batteries prices are and the range is. Currently, there are 2 million cars, hybrid as well as battery-operated car. And out of 1.5 billion conventional cars. If you look at the logistics, even if you increase the battery cars and the hydrogen and to 50 million, they will reduce the global demand for oil by less than 1 billion a year. While what they can do in the long, they will never replace oil in transport at all, even during the 21st century and probably further beyond that. What they will do is they will decelerate the speed of a growth of a global demand for oil. So there will be no post-oil era, no matter what battery cars are, or LNG cars will do, or hydrogen will do.